I'm Dawn Filmony. I am at Colorado State University in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics as a professor. But in addition, I recently started doing some work for the broader Office of Engagement here at CSU. And so in one of those roles, because our state has been asked to engage far more fully by several state agencies, I've gotten the opportunity to get to know the hemp sector a little better. And when Abdel and John and the broader group of you who work with the Regional Research Committee decided they wanted to have a conference and they wanted to have it in Fort Collins before we knew it'd be virtual, I offered to be a part of the planning team, and it's been a great experience. But because of my background in econ, I'll be kind of moderating today's session with you all, even though it's mostly going to be led by our great speakers. I'll be doing my best to try to keep us on time. We did hear you all last week and made sure a break got built into today that will give you a little chance to stand up and walk around without missing anything. And so hopefully this day will go smoothly for you all. I do just want to, number one, thank the great set of speakers and program from last week. I think they really set the tone. The rest of the next few weeks really quite well. And I think you'll actually even see really how it provided a really good basis for what a lot of our speakers today will talk about. I do also want to thank again Abdel for all the work he did to organize this. And it was not a year anyone was jealous of anyone organizing a conference. As you all know, we were all supposed to be meeting face-to-face back in March. And we did our best here under his guidance to make sure we still got a conference put together under a little bit of challenging conditions, but perhaps it's even allowed more people to participate. And of course, the reason I think you could do that so well is beyond the team we always had put together for this conference, both Monique and Brian Mitchell have stepped in and really been great administrative support for us all. So if you get a chance in the chat box or whatever, make sure you show your appreciation to them for helping us pull this off. Because we're just the talking heads. All the magic's behind the curtains, right? So again, we're starting off this morning. For those of you who didn't get a chance to join us, I do think we're, if we haven't already, we're finding solutions to make sure materials during the weeks that you're not going to be able to attend live are in some way, shape, or form made available to you all. Abdel, maybe if you want to type something in the chat box, or Monique about where we on progress for those. But just to set the stage, I feel like last week really was a great starting point to get an overview of what's going on. I think we in academia and the government quickly learned from some people in the Q&A and chat sessions that, and this is not surprising, we're a little bit behind on data and trends. We're doing our best to pull that together, but because we don't have nearly the system or infrastructure put into place to track what's going on in this sector, because it is so new and so nascent, this is exactly why we're having this conference. I think we all can learn from each other, because we definitely pulled together a lot of good information, data, and maps, but we learned quickly that it is so dynamic and so changing that there's probably things we all still can learn, and we're going to do our best to catch up there. And I think today is going to be another example of that, where I think our speakers are very confident they're going to teach everybody on the call something new, but we know some of you who are living and breathing this on the ground probably can add some interesting context that we can't yet find and capture in data. So it should be an interesting set of discussions, I hope. What I felt like worked really well last week, before I turn it over to Tyler, is although we will leave a time for Q&A in a more traditional way, including being able to unmute yourself and talk, if things come up while the presentation is going on, you can also start typing some of your questions in the chat box, not only for maybe the speaker to start responding to or to think about, but also, again, others here in attendance may know resources and links that might be interesting for you as well. So that at least made it feel more interactive to me last week, and we welcome you guys to do the exact same type of things this week to make this feel like it is an interactive session. So with that, Monique or Abdel or Tyler, is there anything else you feel we need to cover before we start into the speakers?
No, Dawn, we can start. Thank you. I don't have anything to add.
And Abdel, it'd be great if you keep answering questions about how these materials are going to be shared in the chat box, because that seems to be top of mind for folks. So with that, then, our first speaker this morning, I guess if you don't have the agenda open, I think we've been doing a great job of getting those out in emails. We will have about 5 speakers this morning, starting with an overview from Tyler Mark from Kentucky. And then we plan to do 3 presentations before a break, but if we're running a bit long, we can break at a different point in time. But we'll be hearing from a couple people from the USDA after Tyler. Then we'll take a break and hear an industry perspective from Kelly Shea at Charlotte's Web. And then Jane Kolondinsky will be wrapping up this morning with a look at where the consumer mind space is on that. So with that, I'm going to start by turning it over to Dr. Tyler Mark from the University of Kentucky, one of my peers. In one of my fun small world stories, my daughter, who's studying at University of Maryland, met Tyler before I did and told me great things about him before I got a chance to meet him. She actually started working on a hemp project there before I got involved in hemp. So it's fun now that Tyler and I've gotten the chance to work together so often. And what I would say about him is because, again, Kentucky, like Colorado, was working in this sector a little earlier than an average state because of some choices our states made. You know, I think he's just got both a wealth of information about what they've learned there in his state, but because he's been a connecting node with a lot of other states as they've tried to grow their industry. He's, I think, gotten a lot of his perspective from the fact that he's gotten to talk to a lot of different states. Although he comes from Kentucky, I think he'll give a great starting point for today to give a national overview of what's happening in the market. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tyler.
Thank you very much, Don. And yeah, it's an interesting story how I got involved in this. I come from a farm background, but have been working with the Kentucky Department of Ag since 2014 with some of their data. So it's been interesting to get to see this industry develop, and something that I don't think a lot of people get to do. So let me see, I'll share my screen and off we go. Good morning from the Commonwealth of Kentucky, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning to present on the second session on July 8th of 2020 in the session on hemp economics, markets, consumer perceptions, and risk management. My name is Tyler Mark. I'm an associate professor at the University of Kentucky, and I've been working on this topic for a number of years now. And it is my pleasure to get to present today and kind of open this session up and try and lay the groundwork for what are a very interesting set of presentations coming up after me that hopefully will generate a lot of questions about the industry and what all's going on, and spark some discussion as we continue to march forward toward our August date for this conference and the focus groups that are going to take place there. So I'm going to take a little bit of different tact for this presentation, in that I'm going to, throughout the presentation, throw in some little blurbs on some different pieces of information that are coming down the pipe in terms of grants and projects that I know that are out there and going on. This is by no means an exhaustive list. But these are a lot of projects and stuff that I know about that are going on, that are going to provide some data that really help to shape the future of this industry, this infant industry that's going through a lot of growing pains right now. So feel free to ask questions about those during the Q&A time, or follow up with me later on if you have additional questions about what all is going on in a lot of these different studies. But I'm going to start off by talking about some of the economics and marketing overview for hemp in general. So when I think about hemp in general, I think there's a lot of words that come to mind. So things like crop failure, uncertainty, risk, learning curves, bankruptcies, bubbles, booms, bust, sustainability, infancy. It's a silver bullet crop. So these are all like key words that have been in a number of articles and stuff that have been released about the industry, and has an interesting future and an opportunity in front of it. And And to me, hemp is really just another tool in a tool belt for producers. And this is really what I want to talk to producers about when I go out and do meetings with them and talk about these markets. This is just another opportunity and another way, another crop to put in your tool belt to mix with your corn, your soybeans, and your other crops that you may be producing. So please don't think about hemp as a silver bullet. And for those states that are just getting in this, I can't stress how important that is for producers not to bet the farm on this. I mean, I have seen it done, and sometimes it turns out well, and sometimes it doesn't turn out so well. So hemp, it's really just another tool in the tool belt for our producers, and another product that has lots of applications upstream in terms of products that it can produce. So 50,000 some odd plus products that can come out of this crop. However, the thing that we have to keep in mind with that is that they have to be able to produce a positive profit that's greater than the alternative for producers, so or processors, or whatever level of the supply chain that you're going to be on. You have to remember it has to return positive profits that's above and beyond what they can do with alternative products. So keep that in mind as we go forward today. So this is just a graphic that kind of shows the expansion of hemp across the country. And I've done total planted hemp acres, and this is from FSA, from their 578 forms. Now keep in mind, I know this is understated. We don't have all the acres included in this, but hopefully going forward, as we roll into the 2018 Farm Bill and the interim final rule and the requirements to report these acres on 578 forms, that we get a much more complete picture. But like I said, I know that this is an incomplete picture, but it is a nice way to represent and show how hemp has expanded across the country since 2014 and 2015 here in this graphic. So this is 2015 to 2019. And again, this is FSA data. There are a number of other data sources out there as well. Vote Hemp puts out a number on an annual basis as far as licensed acres. We've done some ourselves with a paper that Suzanne is going to talk about next for an ERS report. So those numbers are really mixed, but do know that these are understated. So let's roll forward to 2020 and what we might expect. And this is from Hemp Industry Daily. So as you'll notice throughout this presentation, I take some information from some third-party sources and stuff in a lot of reading, because one of the key things that we know about this industry is that there's a lack of data out there on it. So we're relying right now on a lot of third-party sources to pull a lot of this together. This is data that the Hemp Industry Daily has pulled together, and it's really on hemp acreage, licensed acreage for 2020. So you can see that as of June 18, they were reporting about 465,000 licensed acres for 2020, which is down slightly, about 9% from where we were in 2019. But what you're also going to notice is the huge increase in the number of growers. So as we get more and more states involved in hemp production, we have more growers. We still have a lot of growers that have interest in getting into this crop, even though they've seen what's gone on in some of the states that have had this crop for a number of years. But you can still see some of the large players, Kentucky, Colorado, Tennessee, with more than 30,000 acres. And then you got a lot of other large states, Montana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Missouri, Florida, North Carolina with that 10,000 to 30,000 acres. And then, some states that are just entering that have smaller acreages. But as you can see, this crop and the potential of this crop has provided a lot of opportunities for producers across the country to at least dabble or to get into the production of hemp. So it's still creating and generating a lot of excitement across the country, even though it's had a lot of growing pains over the past, specifically the past 2 years. And we can talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. I also put in here, and this is from the interim final rule. This is the estimated net benefits of the hemp rule. And so in 2020, they estimated that there would be about $20 million worth of net benefits to the country. 2021, a little over 40 million. And in 2022, about 79 million in net benefits. So this is, I think we've actually probably already went over this a little bit, over these estimates, but this is another piece of information that points at we really need more information about what is the true economic impact and what are the benefits of having this crop as a tool in the tool belt, so to speak, for producers going forward. So to help address some of that, I did want to kind of bring your attention to some resources that are on the way. There's an economic impact study of hemp production that's right now. The project just started in May. It's a project led by Jane Kalowski. She'll be talking later in this session, and at the University of Vermont, University of Vermont. University of Kentucky is partnering with her on that, along with Colorado State University. So we were able to secure some funding to do some economic impact study of hemp production. So we've got that project underway. So be looking for more information on that in the coming months, in the coming years, actually. So it's a 3-year project. So that will be another way to help add some relevance to this industry and the actual economic impact that it's having on our communities. In terms of economics, I know a lot of people don't want to think about this and they struggle to think about this, but what's happened since 2014, in 2014 we really came out and we thought that the production was really going to take place in grain, seed, and fiber markets, but then in 15, 16, 17, and 18, we really started to see the explosion of the CBD market, or essential oils, and I'll try and refer to them as essential oils because there's really more to it than just CBD. And within that, we've seen a rapid expansion in the number of acres across the country. So you saw in 2018, Vote Hemp would have had a number of about 78,000. In 2019, we had 500,000 acres. 2020, we got over 400,000 of licensed acres. So we've seen this tremendous explosion in the shift out in supply of material. But we probably haven't seen the same amount of increase in demand for these products. So we've seen a huge shift out in supply, not quite as much of a shift out in demand, if any shift out in demand, which has put a lot of downward pressure on prices. So producers, processors, and consumers across the board need to be aware of this and understand that economics are important, and they can't just be overlooked when we're looking at this new market in this infant industry. So this is just a graphic from Panex Exchange, or the data is from Panex Exchange, and we look at pricing from January of 19 all the way through June of 2020. What you'll see is that prices kind of peaked out for these 3 main states, at least Kentucky, Oregon, and Colorado, that they were reporting on in 2019, peaked out around July, and then from that point onward, price dropped significantly. So we dropped from almost $4.50 a point all the way down to less than $1 a point, and have been holding steady somewhere between 60 cents and 80 cents a point basically since January of 2020. 2 additional areas came into their data set in January of 2020, and they are the Great Plains and the Northeast. So I've got those represented here as well, but you can see this dramatic drop that took place from July of 19 all the way through December of 19, and this created most of this is a function of oversupply in the industry. Some of it's a function of a lot of contractors or processors started putting out contracts in 19 and expected that price to hold, and then once they saw the amount of production, that price fell drastically. There could also be some processing issues in there, and do we have enough processing capacity? I didn't specifically list that study in here, but we are working on a study of what is the actual processing capacity of the U.S., and it'll primarily be focused on CBD processing, but we'll try and get in some information on fiber and grain processing as well. However, those two markets, there's not quite as many processors out there as there is for the CBD or essential oil side of the market. So I wanted to bring in maybe just a little more of a graphic shot of 2020 and what's happening with prices in 2020. So I've got the midpoint, the low side, and the high side here for all 5 of the regions. What you're going to see is those producers in the Northeast are probably, if these prices are accurate, that they're seeing a little higher prices relative to everybody else in the country. And that's at the midpoint, the low, and the high. So that's an interesting piece. If you're up in the Northeast, hopefully you are seeing some of those pricing advantages. Colorado tends to see a little higher price than some as well, and the Great Plains is seeing some higher prices. And I think some of this is a function of, especially in the Great Plains, that these are newer states that are coming into this, so they're just getting some of this figured out, and there's not a whole lot of processing available, but there are acres there that are being processed. So that could be some of what's going on in that market. There are a lot of resources hopefully on the way. One of the areas that we see is these pricing is basically all done on a per percentage point of CBD in that, but I think as this market continues to evolve, that pricing strategy is going to continue to have to change and look at the profile of what cannabinoids, terpenes, THC, that full profile of what all is in that floral material that can be extracted, and processors are going to have to think about different strategies to pay based on that full portfolio or profile of products that are in that versus just paying on one specific cannabinoid going forward. Now, it's going to take some time to make that change in the industry, but I think that's something that will happen over time. We've got some ARS funding that we're working on different pricing strategies going forward, and how might we change the pricing mechanism for these crops as we move forward. So look for more information to come on that. I'm definitely open to suggestions and discussions about how people think that these prices might change, and some specific pricing strategies that might be really interesting to look at going forward. But hopefully through the S1084 group that many of you represent, will be taking, especially through the essential oils trials. Hopefully we'll be able to get some really good data out of that and look at some of the profiles across the country and how those profiles change for the cannabinoid and terpene and THC profiles across the country and how they change. So that some really interesting research that's on the way as well. I thought I'd throw in just a little bit on budgets. The next couple of slides have a few things on the budget side of things. Hemp and grain, or hemp grain and fiber, they still need a lot of help. These have had lower returns relative to the essential oil side of the market, so it really hadn't received a whole lot of attention. But now, as the profitability of the essential oil side of the market is coming down, I think we're starting to see a shift back a little bit more towards the grain and fiber side of things. So hopefully that mixed with the additional research and research funding that's going on in this space will help to really boost this sector, these two sectors. And I think I'm really excited about these two sides of the market, specifically the fiber side. I know, especially here in the state of Kentucky, we're really known as a fiber state, and we produce a lot of biomass in terms of hay for our livestock production. So we have the equipment, we have the know-how to do some of this, but we have some huge hurdles to get over in terms of we still need chemicals and some of those types of things. And we can talk about in some of the hurdles and barriers to this industry at the end. We have to get up to a threshold or a level of acreage in the country for these crops, for these chemical companies to really consider doing the research that it takes to get chemicals labeled for these two industries. And I think for these two industries to really take off, we're going to have some additional chemicals in the space for insecticides, herbicides, fungicides. We've gotten a start on that with some labels through EPA, but we're going to need more to help that out. If you look at the bottom line here, $225 returns above fixed cost or all cost on a per acre basis for grain, and it's negative for fiber. So these haven't been really interesting pieces to look at, but they're out there, and I think that as this industry continues to mature, these sides will get more and more interest from groups and processors, and these markets will continue to grow. For the CBD side of things, I've got two different models here. And by the way, you can get to all this information on budgets and stuff if you go to the University of Kentucky Industrial Hemp page. You can find all the budgets, and they're free for download, and you can modify those to meet the needs of your state, your area, and just look at those and see how profitability changes. I've got this one set up for a tobacco model and a plasticulture model. Tobacco model may also think about a bare ground type model, so it's kind of what you see on the top in the top frame on this. I'm running at 7% CBD. Now, depend upon where you're at in the country and what your rules are. If you're just a THCA state, you may think that that's extremely low, but in the state of Kentucky, where we're a total THC state, these are pretty common CBD ranges that we'll see in that 6 to 7.5. And I tend to use a 25-to-1 ratio. So we got 0.3% THC allowed. So a 25-to-1 would get me at a max of about 7.5% CBD on that plant. Now, there's a lot of research out there, talking about what those ranges are, and they tend to fluctuate somewhere between that 23 to 28-to-1 ratio. I think over time, we'll get better breeding through a lot of the programs that are starting up on that side, and we may be able to change those ratios and get much higher levels, or we shift and change from 0.3% THC allowed to 1%, and then you see that go up significantly in terms of CBD percentages. But there are some downsides to that too, and we can talk about that a little later. But I've got this set up at 7%, 90 cents a pound, 3,000 plants an acre. If you pull that all the way down, 6,700, but I would say that that looks like a really good number, and is an interesting number. But as we saw in 2019, you got to make sure that you can get paid, and that the arrangements that you have with your processor, and you have a market for it, that you can actually achieve that level, because you still got almost $10,000 in variable costs, and those variable costs can be quite expensive for this crop. One thing that I would say that's probably understated in this budget is that the amount of testing that needs to be done. So that would be one area to think about, is the number of tests that you may need on an annual basis to make sure that you stay within that allowable 0.3% THC level. So those could ramp up. I think I have 3 or 4 built in here, but you may need 5 or 6 tests, depending upon where you're at in the process, what type of genetics you're using, and how susceptible those genetics are to reaching above the 0.3% THC level. Under the plasticulture, it's quite a bit lower, but you got lower plant populations, but you also still have quite a bit of cost wrapped up in that as well. And then I put in some sensitivity on this. All these sensitivity tables are built into the spreadsheet, so you can look at a range of things within that spreadsheet if you want to go download that. So, one thing I did want to bring to your attention, and as the prices and stuff for this industry continue to come down, and these industries continue to commoditize, and prices fall down to those levels of traditional crops in the area. So in terms of Kentucky, what I think about is grain and fiber are really going to compete with corn and bean pricing and acreages. On the essential oil side of things, I think about those crops competing with the tobacco industry and having to have those types of returns to warrant production of that, especially right now in the types of systems we're looking at. One thing I failed to mention in some of these budgets is that there is a lot of research going into mechanized harvesting methods. So it's more of a traditional row crop style essential oil production, and you got different companies out there looking at that that are really interesting platforms to grow the CBD on, so we're not so reliant on the clonal and feminized seed side of the equation, and we can do more broad acre crops that have both male and female. Yes, that brings your CBD percentage down, but you also have additional acreages that you're applying that to. So there's a lot of different lines of thought going on and research going on in that. So I'm looking forward to see where that plays out long term. But as I was talking about the prices for these industries are coming down, one area that we still haven't seen a whole lot of downward movement in is the clone and the feminized seed side of the equation. We've seen some downward movement, but these industries are new. They're just starting to grow as well. They still are, as we heard from the first session on this, they're still working on the seed standards that need to come into this industry. And there's a lot of work that has to be done to get the seed industry up to standards that we're used to with a lot of our other traditional commodities that we produce around the country. So as that side of the industry continues to mature, I think we'll continue to see these prices come down for a lot of these varieties or cultivars going forward. One thing I would kind of caution you on is depend upon how the interim final rule plays out and what those allowable levels stay at. Does it stay at 0.3? Does it go up? That can have an impact on the availability of clones, seeds in this side of the industry that will meet those thresholds once we roll forward and everybody rolls into the interim final rule standards in 2021. So that could put continued pressure on this side of the industry, and prices could continue to stay elevated. And I bring this side up because this is one of the biggest costs in terms of the per acre cost for the production of hemp is in the transplants, clones, feminized seed side of the market. This data right here is from Hemp Benchmarks. So you can still see that we're seeing somewhere between $1.75 and $4.50 on the clone per clone price. Feminized seed is still in that $25 to $1.25 per seed range. Then one of the other ones that you're starting to see, one of the other cannabinoids you're starting to see come into the market is on the CBG side of the things. So CBG clones are from $4.25 to $7.50, and CBG seeds are 40 cents to $2. So quite expensive, but you could go back and modify our budgets if you knew the the percent CBG that came out of that, you could go back and modify those budgets to change it around and look at a CBG type budget if you really wanted to do that and plug these types of numbers in and look at the profit potential out of that side. There is a really exciting study on the way for this one. This is AMS funded. We're going to be doing a survey of all U.S. hemp growers, and we're going to survey the production costs. This is a joint project between University of Kentucky and Colorado State and AMS. So this survey will be going out hopefully in late 2020, and it'll have some focus groups, farmer focus groups wrapped around it as well. Some of you are aware of this study. But there are probably a number of you that will also still be contacted to help collect some information for this going forward as well. So be on the lookout from me for more information to come on this side. So let's talk a little bit about some of the markets. This is an older study that we did at the University of Kentucky, and this is primarily focused on the grain side of things. So basically this is data from Nielsen data set, and we've tried to narrow this down and tried to identify hemp products. So what you're going to see here is you're going to see granola on the left-hand side. Is you're going to see granola, Nature Valley. These are granola bars, and you can see a whole lot of granola bars there. And then what you're going to see under that in the parentheses, those are the percentage of those observations or percentage of those products that have hemp identified in the label. So we had a whole lot of hemp identified in the label for granola products back in 2008. Not quite as much in 2015. However, we have seen the number of products in those areas grow. So it's kind of misleading. But in total, hemp is in about 23% of those products. And then we also have nuts, nutritional, protein, lip remedies. So this is really, if you ever go to the grocery store and you scan your Kroger card or whatever card you have to get rewards or points, or they send you coupons and stuff, this is data that's collected through a system like that is then opened up to researchers, or researchers can participate and look at consumer trends and expenditures on these types of products. So this is a study we did a couple of years ago with one of my PhD students, Wonsun Kim, who's now at Arkansas State. And we're in the process of trying to update this study to bring in additional years, because if you notice in 2015, there was very little probably CBD, or there was no CBD in any of these outlets. But now in 2020, we've seen quite a bit of expansion into those supermarkets, convenience store markets for these CBD products. So we're trying to get updated data to replicate this study again. But so the key findings that we had: sales continue to increase. Income, age, education, race, religion, year are all key determinants of buying these products. There seems to be a changing mix of what consumers are purchasing, which is totally expected. And we know that this is a limited picture, because one of the downsides to this study is we can only identify that hemp is on the label. We can't identify what percentage of that product was hemp versus other products that were in that. So we know it's a limited picture, and we also still need to understand more about the expenditures on these types of products. But as I said, we're in the process of trying to update these results. So hopefully there'll be more information to come on the grain side of things. I want to bring your attention to two CBD consumer studies. These were both done by New Frontier Data. The first one on the left-hand side is of the EU, and they administered an online survey in October of 2019. It covered 17 countries, and there was a sample size of 3,100. And really the objectives of that study or survey were to look at the awareness and use of CBD across the European Union. A similar study, almost the exact same study, was done in the U.S. in March of 2020. They ended up having a sample size of a little over 4,000. So these are out there. I will warn you that they are with New Frontier Data. So I mean, it's a paid service, so you would have to pay to get access to the full studies. But they are out there, and probably two of the more, at least in my opinion right now, the more comprehensive studies have been done, although they are fairly small, or they are small sample sizes. But this at least starts to give us a glimpse into the consumer, and Jane will talk a little bit more about the consumer side when we get to her talk a little later in this session. So a couple of the interesting things that came out of this. Have you ever heard of CBD? So EU, 56% of reported yes, 86% of consumers reported yes. So we have so consumers in the US are more aware of CBD products than they are in the EU. So from an education standpoint, this may be something interesting to think about, in that if we're going to open up markets in other countries, we have to do a lot of education of these consumers of what CBD or essential oils are, how they're used, what they're meant for. So there's a lot of education that's going to have to go into this going forward. Another interesting piece that I kind of pulled out of this was on the concerns about CBD. So there's a lot of people that are really concerned about the quality, the accuracy of dosing, and contaminants in that product. So if you look at the left-hand side graph, and then you look at the left-hand side under concerned, you're going to see over 70% of the respondents to the EU survey were really concerned about the quality of the product that they were consuming, how accurate was the dosing, and were there any contaminants in that product that they were consuming. So this kind of confirms some of that anecdotal evidence that I hear from consumers as they talk about, are we really getting what we pay for? Is what is on the label actually in there? So this leads us down the path of, how do we educate consumers? How do we build trust for consumers to understand what is in these products? If you look at the U.S., it's a lot of similar patterns. There's maybe not as much worry about the contaminant side of things, but they're more in the U.S. Maybe we're a little more worried about taste, but we're still also worried about the quality and dosing accuracies. And I think this is going to be some questions that have to be answered going forward for this industry to continue to grow as we move forward, and as this product gets put into more and more products as laws allow. One thing you'll also see on here is the presence of THC comes up as well. Consumers in the U.S. are not as worried about it as consumers in the EU, but just differences in consumers and understanding the markets that you're getting into is extremely important. This also kind of goes along with a study that was done. This is a smaller survey that was done back in October of 19. And the Natural Products Association did this online survey, and they talked about 5-to-1 margin Americans say FDA overdue to regulate CBD because they show that CBD usage drops sharply when consumers learn that FDA has no standards for these products. So this kind of speaks again to that. We need to develop the standards. We need to develop education to continue to help these markets develop and increase in demand. The last thing that I kind of put in here, so this is again from that study from New Frontier Data. There's two studies from New Frontier Data. On the left, you got the EU, and about 22% of consumers spend 20 euros or more on a monthly basis on CBD. So 20 euros is about $22.58, if my math is correct, and the exchange rate from this morning. So about 22% spend less than 20 euros, and about, let's see, about 50, almost 60%, 70% spend less than 100 euros per month on CBD. In the U.S., you get 82% spend less than $100 a month on CBD. So just kind of gives you an idea of what type of spending that consumers are willing to do on this. And if you get into that study, you can see all the age demographics and all those breakouts, but I don't have time to go into all that today. So let's talk a little bit about, finish this up, talking about opportunities and hurdles for the industry development. So RJ is going to talk a lot about crop insurance here in a little bit, so I'll leave a lot of that to him, but this is the pilot crop insurance program in all the counties that are covered across the U.S. So as you can see, we have a lot of gaps, but as this pilot program continues to grow, we'll fill in these gaps, but we have a lot to work on for this actual production history crop insurance product that's out there. And I'll let him talk more about that, and we can address other questions in the Q&A. I wanted to make you aware of some resources on the way for this through the Southern Extension Risk Management and Education grants. We do have a couple of projects funded with the University of Tennessee and the University of Maryland, along with the University of Kentucky, and we're working on building some decision aids to help producers understand the risk management practices for hemp and how they might utilize some of these crop insurance tools. But one thing I will say about 2020 is I've heard very little about any contracts being offered out there. So, and one of the stipulations is you have to have a contract to be able to get crop insurance. So that is a bit problematic. So I'm curious to see what type of response we get to the crop insurance program in 2020 and going forward. We still have some issues on transportation, banking. A lot of these are clearing their way up. We still have some mixing of industrial hemp, medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, which is causing some hurdles in some states. Some states are opening it up. So if you have potentially something that is out of compliance in the hemp market, it can be put into the medical or recreational marijuana markets. So those are kind of interesting things that are coming about. Access to labor is still a problem in some areas. And as states continue to come on board, they're going to figure out how labor intensive this crop can be and some of the learning curves that are there. Standards for final products and testing, so the THC levels. We're working on another project with ARS. I'm not directly involved with that, but trying to look at some of those standards and testing procedures. So I'm hopeful that there's something going to come out of that. FDA and their rules, state plans are still up there and still getting approved. The state fee schedules, keep in mind that these can vary drastically from one state to another, and how the fee schedules work and can create competitive advantages one way or another. Still, a number of lawsuits in international markets are going to continue to play a role. Contract structure and how contracts are done is another area. For 2019, it seemed like there were very few contracts out there. Some of the things I read talked about 60% of the crop was grown without any type of contract. So that can be a very risky position to be in. However, there may not be contracts out there to actually get involved with. So just understand if you do have a contract, what it actually means. So I would say involve a lawyer. Also, make sure that you know how you're going to store this product, because it can have to be stored for a very long time. We've got producers in Kentucky that have got floral material that they've stored for multiple years now. So make sure you know how you're going to store that, how you're going to keep that quality up. So there's a number of contract considerations, and I'm not going to run through all of these, but how's the hemp tracked through the system? Who's responsible if it's seized? Who's providing the plant material and genetics? So just make sure you understand all the ins and outs of that contract. And one thing I would say is through the Northeast Risk Management and Education Center, there are a couple of grants funded through that group to look at hemp and hemp contracts, specifically at the University of Maryland, and then I think there's also some out of Penn State University. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what some of those contract templates look like. I think those will be good tools for both producers and processors to look at and and evaluate what all is going on there. Drying methods is another one. I know at the University of Kentucky, Dr. Bob Pierce is working on some drying tests and how the method that you use to dry it, how that impacts that cannabinoid or those profiles for hemp. So there's all kinds of different methods out there, and some of you are probably getting into to several of these. But it really makes me want to pull my hair out because there's so many different options. They all have different costs. They all have different impacts on the final products. So some other things that we really haven't had a time to think about or talk about yet in this is there's also nuisance laws as we get hemp production and closer to neighborhoods or schools. You get that skunk smell that comes off of it, as well as in the processing side. So we've got some nuisance law things that are going on right to farm. On the law side of things, increased THC level to 1%. One thing that's kind of interesting on this is increasing it to 1% would definitely allow more of we would definitely have less samples go hot, hopefully. I think Doris presented a little bit on the number of samples that went hot in Kentucky last year and how it's grown. However, on the flip side of that coin is that if we increase it to 1%, now you're looking at 25% CBD. So the number of acres of CBD, unless demand grows drastically, could be cut down. So you may have less demand for the acreages of CBD if you increase it to 1%. So there are pros and cons to both sides of that coin. And it also presents some interesting impacts for trade that's going on as well, because some of our trade agreements have 0.3% or 0.2% THC allowable limits in them. So how those would be negotiated. Animal feed's another one. Crop response, how other crops are going to respond as hemp has grown is another problem that's being looked at, and that's being looked at actually at Oregon State right now. John Antle out there is looking at modeling some crop response, or it's actually crop adoption of hemp, how producers might adopt the production of hemp in the Oregon area. So that'll be an interesting study coming out. Genetic availability and the genetics that are available. Processing capacity, are we under or over our processing capacity needs? Economies of scale, both at the production level and processing. Byproducts that can come off of this, and dual and triple crop systems. So all these are opportunities and hurdles that this industry is going to have to continue to tackle. And keep in mind, it's a growing infant industry that's going to have a lot of growing pains. So going forward in 2020, and this is really for those states that haven't had a whole lot of production or production history, the things to think about when I talk to producers is how many acres can I actually effectively manage? Do I have access to the market I'm producing for? How much do I have to invest? How am I going to finance it? What type of contract do I have? Do I understand the contract? Have I done my homework? What happens? What is my plan B? So if things fall apart, my contract fails, how am I going to get rid of that? Most producers aren't thinking about a plan B because they're very used to that plan A. When I grow those traditional commodities, there is a market there. But in this crop, you have to think about that plan B. Processors, it's a lot of the same thing. What happens? What's my plan B if my venture capital is pulled out? How am I going to continue onward? Who has the liability on this crop? How much can I effectively process? Understanding the rules and regs in each state, and Kelly's going to talk a little bit about that, as how each state is different and the impact that has. And again, my name is Tyler Mark. I'm at the University of Kentucky Production Economist. Feel free at any point in time to reach out, ask questions, and I'm more than willing to try and help answer those questions or at least point you in the right direction. And thank you again for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Tyler. I know we handled quite a few questions coming in as the presentation was going. But I think we have at least time for one or two questions before we move on to our next speaker. If anybody wants to either unmute themselves and ask by voice or type in the chat box. I know there was a lot covered there, so at least I was just barely keeping up, but I think it was exactly what it was promoted as being, as a great overview. So does anybody have any questions questions for Tyler before we move on? He'll also be here all day, or all morning. Well, Tyler, they seem to want us to keep going. So know that he will be sitting and watching the subsequent presentations as well. So you can certainly ask him questions while we're going on. But our next presentation this morning is going to be from Suzanne Thornsberry. Tyler mentioned her in his talk a little bit because she actually helped him put together a report when she was still over at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, but she's actually joining us today as part of the Office of the Chief Scientist, where she moved to be the Senior Advisor on Agricultural Economics in Rural Communities. And she'll be continuing to work on this particular issue in that role. I was fortunate to get to know Suzanne probably a couple decades ago now, because she started out actually as a peer professor at Michigan State University working on specialty crops, but since then has moved and had several positions with the USDA. So I think today she's going to bring a really important and interesting perspective to our discussion about how that pilot program from 2014 did play out in the eyes of the USDA. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Suzanne to introduce a little bit more herself and start her presentation.
Great, thank you, Dawn, and thanks everybody for being here. It's interesting how we all kind of came to work in this hemp area. Dawn mentioned that I was at the Economic Research Service not too long ago, and my role there was the branch chief for crops. And in the crops branch, I used to say, we cover the gamut, specialty crops, field crops, everything in between, which is true. But one thing that we hadn't worked on since the 1970s was hemp. And so when the 2018 Farm Bill came out and said, ERS will do a review of the 2014 pilot programs, we really had to get ourselves geared up in a pretty big hurry, both on what was happening and, of course, how those pilot programs had played out. And I will say it was one of the more interesting reports I'd ever done, and also one of the most challenging, because things were changing so fast. And you can imagine it takes quite a long time to get a report through a review and clearance process for the federal government. And as the report was going through that process, things were changing on a daily basis. So we were adding, and the editors were quite frustrated with us because everything was changing. And so we were adding updates as it went along up until the time that report came out. So I'm happy to be here today, give you a little perspective. As you'll see, I draw very heavily on that report. And so I think I'll turn it over and let the organizers run the presentation. Good morning. Thank you all for being here today, and thanks to the conference organizers for pulling all of this together. My name is Suzanne Thornsberry. I'm the Senior Advisor for Agricultural Economics and Rural Communities in USDA's Office of the Chief Scientist. For those of you who may not be aware of OCS and what it is we do here, this is an office that was created under the 2008 Farm Bill, and the focus is strategic coordination of science, both across the Department of Agriculture and between USDA and other agencies and departments in the federal government. So today I'm going to talk to you about a review of the state pilot programs that were established under the 2014 Farm Bill. My remarks are going to draw very heavily on a report that was put out by USDA's Economic Research Service in February of this year that reviewed those pilot programs. And I want to give a shout out to my co-authors right at the beginning. From University of Kentucky, Tyler Mark, Jonathan Shepard, and Will Snell, and from Economic Research Service, David Olson and Susan Proper. Now, as Renee Johnson reminded us in last week's session, the 2014 Farm Bill reintroduced U.S. hemp production in the United States by allowing state departments of agriculture and institutions of higher education to legally grow and cultivate hemp for purposes of research, or to license growers in their state for these activities. The 2018 Farm Bill requested then a review of the pilot program, outcomes and lessons learned, and that's the core of the ERS report and what I'm going to talk about today. So state production actually began at different times between 2014 and 2019 for most states. There were a number of things that had to happen first, one of which notably was that states themselves had to pass legislation allowing hemp production to take place in their state again. And for some states, this was a challenge. Where the legislation had to be proposed multiple times or just took longer to actually get in place. So if you look at the map here on this slide, the dark blue boxes are the states that began planting hemp early on and had 5 to 6 years experience by the time between 2014 and 2019. As you get to the lighter colors, those states came in production later during that period. One thing that's notable, and we'll talk more about this as we go along, but the state requirements for what it was that growers needed to do or how things would be put into place were often different from state to state. But nevertheless, acreage increased rapidly. So if you look at this next slide, between 2014 and 2018, you can see that hemp acreage went up substantially, both in the field and in greenhouse plantings in square feet. One thing that became apparent during the pilot programs was the challenge from inconsistency among data or availability of data for folks who are trying to make decisions about where to go with this industry, whether to enter or not, or how they might position themselves and make business decisions. And so in this particular chart, we included a number of sources that were reporting on acreage in this particular period of the pilot programs, just to give some comparison. So the blue bars are numbers that were reported by individual states in their annual reports or other materials that they put out during the pilot programs. And these varied quite a bit in what was actually reported. So it could have been acres that were licensed. Some states reported acres planted. Some reported acres harvested. So there's a mix in there, but summing those up over acres over time, you can certainly see there was an increase. The gray bar in the graph represents acres planted, and these are numbers that growers reported to the Farm Service Agency on their 578, forms, where they were reporting in each year about what they had been doing on their farms. So the gray bar is acres planted among a subset of growers, and that'll be different going forward. But during the pilot programs, these were growers that were involved in other federal programs. There were also a number of private nonprofit organizations that were collecting data on acres and reporting. And so the yellow bar represents acreage that was reported by Vote Hemp over this period. But you can see the thing that was consistent across all these sources is that acreage was increasing rapidly. By 2019, production was widespread across the US, and just to note that this is county level data in this particular map, and these are acres planted reported to USDA Farm Service Agency as of the end of December 2019. At that point, the largest number of planted acres were reported in Colorado, Kentucky, Montana, Oregon, and North Carolina. The pilot programs themselves varied quite a bit between states, both in terms of their support and management of various factors related to the emerging hemp industry. And so we tried to put together a little summary of that. We certainly didn't capture everything, but I think it'll give you a good sense of the variability here. So some things that were similar. All of the states charged fees at some level to cover at least part of their program cost. What differed is the fee schedule, both the amount of fees, how they were collected, who they were collected from, and how they were assessed. A similarity is that state programs all were running on a fairly bare bones staff for support and management, so relatively small staffing resources. In some cases, this was supplemented from university extension services. And what we saw over time during the pilot programs is those extension services also ramped up their activities and the support that they were able to provide. But just to give you an idea of the variability in staffing, so when we look at average number of field acres covered, and this is across a relatively small sample of states where we could actually collect equivalent numbers on staff and acres. The average number of field acres covered by a staff full-time equivalent person was about 2,500. This is again off relatively small sample of 17 states, but the range was huge. So the range moved from 4 acres to over 20,000 acres. And part of that is because of the difference in area covered by states, not just area planted, but the size of states as a whole. It caused quite a wide variability there. States with programs all required background checks, GPS field locations, often to provide support for growers in terms of law enforcement and if there were any questions about what was planting. And all states produced some sort of annual report. Now, the level of detail that was collected and reported out from each state varied quite widely, and I already mentioned before about the differences in how even just acreage was defined from state to state. At the same time, the U.S. was increasing their hemp production. Other countries were increasing as well. A number of other countries were already active in the hemp market prior to 2014, but you can see the numbers went up in these last few years. So if you look at the chart on the left, this is Canada, data reported on acres planted by Health Canada, and it goes back to 1998. So there's been production for some time, but it really ramped up after 2011. Still variable from year to year, though, which is worth noting when you think about market development. The graph on the right is from China. It's a little bit harder to interpret some of this data, but if you look at the line, the black line, that represents hectares planted. And you can see it's really come down over time. This particular data set goes back to 1978, but the acreage has come down substantially, while output, which is the green bars in the graph, has gone up quite a bit, particularly after 2016, indicating that productivity has increased notably in the last few years. Hemp is a traded commodity, and so there are global markets. It was a traded commodity even prior to being legal for production in the United States. And so this next chart shows U.S. imports of hemp oil, in this case, going back to 1999. What you can see here is, again, there's variability quite a bit from year to year, but if you look at what happened beginning around 2013 and moving forward, those imports increased quite a bit, and the black bar in here represents Canada, which has been a major supplier in the last decade. So the pilot programs were instituted to learn more about these markets, to restart the industry, and what are some challenges and lessons learned in moving from these pilot programs to large-scale production and moving under the 2018 Farm Bill provisions. So one thing that people want to ask about and worry about, we all think about a lot, is what's the outlook for hemp, both in terms of market development, what is it that consumers are going to want, and what is it that producers and processors are going to provide. And there's lots of discussion in these meetings about the wide variety of products that can be produced from hemp. And I know we're going to have more of that as we go along too. It's really notable. But in terms of the market outlook, it really is still a rough and tumble ride. So this particular quote comes from an article by a researcher at Oregon State University, but I think he captured it really well. The long-term prognosis is generally favorable across a wide range of product categories and downstream markets. And we talk about that a lot, but the road getting there is likely to be a rough and tumble ride, with as many losers as there will be winners. This is not unusual in an emerging market or a market that's changing substantially, but it's worth noting as we go forward. A couple of issues that came up in the pilot programs, and they certainly have been a focus, and we're going to hear a lot about them over the course of this conference, because these are all areas where a need has been identified. But just to note, contract structure. So particularly in last year, in 2019, there was a lot of attention paid to contracts and whether contracts were binding or not binding, and what happened in various markets as those contracts played out or didn't in some cases. There was a lot of variability, even under the pilot programs, in contract terms, payment schedule, structures, who was speculating in that market, who was actually a producer or a processor, and what were they anticipating for the future. Contracts are not in the public domain, so it's very, very difficult to assess where they're going, but this is an area. Good morning. Thank you all for being here today, and thanks to the conference organizers for pulling all of this together. My name is Suzanne Thornsbury. I'm the Senior Advisor for Agricultural Economics and Rural Communities in USDA's Office of the Chief Scientist. For those of you who may not be aware of OCS and what it is we do here, this is an office that was created under the 2008 Farm Bill, and the focus is strategic coordination of science, both across the Department of Agriculture and between USDA and other agencies and departments in the federal government. So today I'm going to talk to you about a review of the state pilot programs that were established under the 2014 Farm Bill. My remarks are going to draw very heavily on a report that was put out by USDA's Economic Research Service in February of this year that reviewed those pilot programs. And I want to give a shout out to my co-authors right at the beginning. From University of Kentucky, Tyler Mark, Jonathan Shepard, and Will Snell, and from Economic Research Service, David Olson and Susan Proper. Now, as Renee Johnson reminded us in last week's session, the 2014 Farm Bill reintroduced U.S. hemp production in the United States. by allowing state departments of agriculture and institutions of higher education to legally grow and cultivate hemp for purposes of research or to license growers in their state for these activities. The 2018 Farm Bill requested then a review of the pilot program, outcomes, and lessons learned, and that's the core of the ERS report and what I'm going to talk about today. So state production actually began at different times between 2014 and 2019 for most states. There were a number of things that had to happen first, one of which notably was that states themselves had to pass legislation allowing hemp production to take place in their state again. And for some states, this was a challenge. Where the legislation had to be proposed multiple times or just took longer to actually get in place. So if you look at the map here on this slide, the dark blue boxes are the states that began planting hemp early on and had 5 to 6 years experience by the time between 2014 and 2019. As you get to the lighter colors, those states came in production later during that period. One thing that's notable, and we'll talk more about this as we go along, but the state requirements for what it was that growers needed to do or how things would be put into place were often different from state to state. But nevertheless, acreage increased rapidly. So if you look at this next slide, between 2014 and 2018, you can see that hemp acreage went up substantially, both in the field and in greenhouse plantings in square feet. One thing that became apparent during the pilot programs was the challenge from inconsistency among data or availability of data for folks who were trying to make decisions about where to go with this industry, whether to enter or not, or how they might position themselves and make business decisions. And so in this particular chart, we included a number of sources that were reporting on acreage in this particular period of the pilot programs, just to give some comparison. So the blue bars are numbers that were reported by individual states in their annual reports or other materials that they put out during the pilot programs. And these varied quite a bit in what was actually reported. So it could have been acres that were licensed. Some states reported acres planted. Some reported acres harvested. So there's a mix in there, but summing those up over acres over time, you can certainly see there was an increase. The gray bar in the graph represents acres planted, and these are numbers that growers reported to the Farm Service Agency on their 578, forms where they were reporting in each year about what they had been doing on their farms. So the gray bar is acres planted among a subset of growers, and that'll be different going forward, but during the pilot programs, these were growers that were involved in other federal programs. There were also a number of private nonprofit organizations that were collecting data on acres and reporting, and so the yellow bar represents acreage that was reported by Vote Hemp over this period. But you can see the thing that was consistent across all these sources is that acreage was increasing rapidly. By 2019, production was widespread across the U.S., and just to note that this is county level data in this particular map, and these are acres planted reported to USDA Farm Service Agency as of the end of December 2019. At that point, the largest number of planted acres were reported in Colorado, Kentucky, Montana, Oregon, and North Carolina. The pilot programs themselves varied quite a bit between states, both in terms of their support and management of various factors related to the emerging hemp industry. And so we tried to put together a little summary of that. We certainly didn't capture everything, but I think it'll give you a good sense of the variability here. So some things that were similar. All of the states charged fees at some level to cover at least part of their program cost. What differed is the fee schedule, both the amount of fees, how they were collected, who they were collected from, and how they were assessed. A similarity is that state programs all were running on a fairly bare bones staff for support and management, so relatively small staffing resources. In some cases, this was supplemented from university extension services, and what we saw over time during the pilot programs is those extension services also ramped up their activities and the support that they were able to provide. But just to give you an idea of the variability in staffing, so when we look at average number of field acres covered, and this is across a relatively small sample of states where we could actually collect equivalent numbers on staff and acres. The average number of field acres covered by a staff full-time equivalent person was about 2,500. This is again off relatively small sample of 17 states, but the range was huge. So the range moved from 4 acres to over 20,000 acres. And part of that is because of the difference in area covered by states, not just area planted, but the size of states as a whole. It caused quite a wide variability there. States with programs all required background checks, GPS field locations, often to provide support for growers in terms of law enforcement and if there were any questions about what was planting. And all states produced some sort of annual report. Now, the level of detail that was collected and reported out from each state varied quite widely, and I already mentioned before about the differences in how even just acreage was defined from state to state. At the same time the U.S. was increasing their hemp production, other countries were increasing as well. Number of other countries were already active in the hemp market prior to 2014, but you can see the numbers went up in these last few years. So if you look at the chart on the left, this is Canada, data reported on acres planted by Health Canada, and it goes back to 1998. So there's been production for some time, but it really ramped up after 2011. Still variable from year to year, though, which is worth noting when you think about market development. The graph on the right is from China. It's a little bit harder to interpret some of this data, but if you look at the line, the black line, that represents hectares planted. And you can see it's really come down over time. This particular data set goes back to 1978, but the acreage has come down substantially, while output, which is the green bars in the graph, has gone up quite a bit, particularly after 2016, indicating that productivity has increased notably in the last few years. Hemp is a traded commodity, and so there are global markets. It was a traded commodity even prior to being legal for production in the United States. And so this next chart shows U.S. imports of hemp oil, in this case going back to 1999. What you can see here is, again, there's variability quite a bit from year to year, but if you look at what happened beginning around 2013 and moving forward, those imports increased quite a bit, and the black bar in here represents Canada, which has been a major supplier in the last decade. So the pilot programs were instituted to learn more about these markets, to restart the industry, and what are some challenges and lessons learned in moving from these pilot programs to large-scale production and moving under the 2018 Farm Bill provisions. So one thing that people want to ask about and worry about, and we all think about a lot, is what's the outlook for hemp, both in terms of market development, what is it that consumers are going to want, and what is it that producers and processors are going to provide. And there's lots of discussion in these meetings about the wide variety of products that can be produced from hemp. And I know we're going to have more of that as we go along too. It's really notable. But in terms of the market outlook, it really is still a rough and tumble ride. So this particular quote comes from an article by a researcher at Oregon State University, but I think he captured it really well. The long-term prognosis is generally favorable across a wide range of product categories and downstream markets, and we talk about that a lot, but the road getting there is likely to be a rough and tumble ride, with as many losers as there will be winners. This is not unusual in an emerging market or a market that's changing substantially, but it's worth noting as we go forward. A couple of issues that came up in the pilot programs, and they certainly have been a focus, and we're going to hear a lot about them over the course of this conference, because these are all areas where a need has been identified. But just to note, contract structure. So particularly in last year, in 2019, there was a lot of attention paid to contracts and whether contracts were binding or not binding, and what happened in various markets as those contracts played out or didn't in some cases. There was a lot of variability, even under the pilot programs, in contract terms, payment schedule, structures, who was speculating in that market, who was actually a producer or a processor, and what were they anticipating for the future. Contracts are not in the public domain, so it's very, very difficult to assess where they're going, but this is an area where future research is definitely needed. Storage was also often a distant thought to producers during the pilot program, particularly as they first entered this market, perhaps largely because they weren't quite sure what the market was going to be or where they were going to sell. A lot of producers, at least anecdotally we hear, did not anticipate needing the volume or the length of storage that they did over time. And going towards the future, it will be interesting to assess sort of impacts of storage needs for hemp, the cost of those, the availability, where it might be required. What are the impacts on storage of other commodities? They're certainly different. They're not just substitutes for each other, but improper storage can definitely lead to degradations in quality. Another issue that was very apparent during the pilot programs was the variability among input cost and availability of inputs. So these two things obviously are very related. One notable place was among availability of seed or clones, and the wide variation in prices for those items. Also, not just pricing, but certainty over what the quality of the seeds or the clones might be. Were they truly what they were represented to be? So there's almost a certification issue here about the characteristics of what's being offered for sale and the certainty of what that is. There were also challenges under the pilot programs about labeled chemicals for hemp and what could or could not be used. There was very little available during the pilot programs, and that was often a challenge for growers. Another area of challenge during the pilot programs was access to credit and risk management, and this came back to defining what the legal status of hemp might be, particularly in terms of operating capital. Growers reported that they were not able to access credit in many cases for operating loans or sort of standard agricultural kinds of loans, or even to set up bank accounts. And a lot of this came back to, was this a legal or an illegal activity? In late December of 2019, there was a statement that came out from a number of federal lending institutions, the Federal Reserve Board, FDIC, state bank supervisors, others, that clarified this to a great extent by saying that banks do not have to file suspicious activity reports for their customers solely because they are growing hemp. So that relieved a little bit of this pressure. There's also a lack of risk management tools during the pilot programs, and it's a very risky new industry. So crop insurance, farm programs, sort of security for the very growing facilities themselves. Would there be a futures market eventually? How would this be traded? And I know we have a speaker coming up from RMA next, so I'm not going to talk about sort of the evolution in this area, but this is something from the pilot program that clearly showed as a need. So just a few words about pricing and data availability. The pilot programs, one of the main challenges that showed were just a lack of data and a lack of information for growers, processors, people who were interested about what was happening in hemp markets. There have been some price sources that have begun to emerge. There are some private pricing sources that are available now. There's also some public price data that's begun to be released from USDA's Ag Marketing Service in their retail reports. This is beginning to provide some transparency about what's going on in markets and some benchmarking for producers to understand where markets are going or where they've come from, or at least provide a basis for analysis. This is a big challenge going forward. So just to summarize, the pilot programs were successful. They reintroduced industrial hemp production into the US. They certainly identified some challenges and highlighted some needs for future research, future efforts to stabilize these markets. A big challenge, and one that continues, is lack of data. But production increased under the pilot programs. Global production increased as well. That wasn't necessarily tied to the US pilot programs, but probably influenced perhaps by a growing US demand. Transitioning to commercial production is underway, but it's going to be a rough and tumble ride as these markets and these industries develop. So just a plug here for something that's happening within USDA. If you haven't seen the USDA Science Blueprint, this is actually a vision for science priorities over the next 5 years going forward. And I mentioned theme 4, there's 5 themes under this blueprint, by the way. but I sort of highlighted theme 4 here, value-added innovations, because a big piece of that is new products and new markets and new uses for products. So this is a place where USDA actually is focused on things that are happening in the hemp market and other markets. And I know there's a few people on this conference that are involved in the theme team going forward. So I just plug that for you. You can find this online. I'd encourage you to take a look. You can also always follow USDA Science through our app or through at USDA Science. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate your time and attention and look forward to answering questions when we get to that stage. Thank you.
We think we have a great plan going forward, and we'll still stay on our time schedule. So we'll be wrapping up at the time we had planned. So I hope you all got to get up and stretch your legs a little bit. And we are going to proceed on again with a slightly altered schedule, and the fact that we didn't get to one of our speakers before the break. So we're going to hear from RJ now. And so we'll have 3 speakers kind of back to back here with questions and answers, and hopefully still have a little time at the end for a broader discussion too. But let me get going so I make sure we save the time we can. So RJ Layer is here representing the Risk Management Agency. He's currently a special advisor to the administrator. And before his work with that agency, he also worked on a congressional ag staff, and he's from a farm himself in Southeast Michigan. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and move to his presentation, and he will be available for questions in the chat box while that's rolling, and we'll have a little time right after. So with that, let's go ahead and start RJ's presentation.
Thank you.
One second while we pull up the presentation.
All right, I wasn't sure if that was on my end or your end or what.
Tyler's gonna run it from his end for you.
No, it's on my end.
We don't see it yet, Tyler.
I know.
Okay.
Let's see.
You could tell us a little bit about yourself, RJ, while that's getting pulled up.
Yeah, so I'm a policy advisor for the administrator here at the Risk Management Agency at USDA. There we go.
All right, let's see if this works.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is RJ Lair, and I am the policy advisor to the administrator of the Risk Management Agency, Martin Barbary. Here at the United States Department of Agriculture. Before we begin, I just like to apologize for my COVID hair. I have not been able to get it cut in about 6 months, so I apologize for that. Anyways, I'm going to be talking to you today very briefly about what sort of risk management tools are available for hemp producers and how we got to where we're at. A little bit of background here. The 2018 Farm Bill gave legal status to hemp that has below 0.3 THC. Industrial hemp is no longer considered under the Controlled Substance Act if it's under that 0.3. And the 0.3% came from the Farm Bill itself. I know that there was some discrepancies and some discussions going back and forth while AMS was drafting the regulation about what constitutes 0.3. The language says in the bill that 0.3 is 0.3 and does not go to 0.39999 or 0.359 or 0.309. It is 0.3. So everything that is 0.3 or below can be insured through the United States Department of Agriculture. Before we had the 2018 Farm Bill, we had the 2014 Farm Bill. The 2014 Farm Bill authorized hemp in all 50 states, territories, and tribes for research and pilot programs. Obviously, the big state that took that really took advantage of this was Kentucky, and as USDA or RMA specifically, was trying to learn about this new crop. The administrator, as well as multiple people from our regional offices, went to Kentucky to learn as much as possible. That being said, when there were hemp conferences going on all around the country, we would have people from our regional offices attend those. To date, 47 states have enacted legislation that would allow for the cultivation of hemp. I'm not quite sure off the top of my head how many states have approved AMS plans or are still operating under the 2014 Farm Bill. But as you can see here, 2019 crop was estimated at roughly 144,000 acres by FSA. However, industry groups thought that there were considerably more acres than that, north of 200,000. Again, here in 2018, we had in excess of $100 billion worth of sales, most of that coming from CBD. However, a small percentage was coming from seed and fiber. I don't have the 2019 sales data readily available, but I would expect that with the decline in price of CBD oil, that those numbers. As I'm sure you all know, the background uses for hemp, it can be grown for fiber, seed, or oil. It's used in a variety of different products, from textiles to hempcrete, which is hemp fibers mixed in with concrete, as well as hemp flooring. In my travels in Kentucky and at different trade shows, I have seen booths there at these shows promoting the benefits of hemp flooring, actually. Obviously, seed and seed oil can be used in industrial products, food, and personal care products. And like you all know, the female flowers contain CBD, and that's the most valuable part. So what are the crop insurance options for 2020? Right now, RMA offers a multi-peril crop insurance, or MPCI, that covers a producer's actual production history, or APH. We also have whole farm revenue protection that is available to producers as well. For those states that are not in the MPCI pilot, and there's 20 or 21 of those, producers in states that have their hemp plans approved can take advantage of a Farm Service Agency program called the Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program, or NAP. So what's covered under MPCI? The coverage against loss of yield due to insurable causes of loss for hemp grown for fiber, grain, or CBD. As you can see here, the catastrophic level, or CAT, covers 50% of the yield at 55% of the price. There's a buy-up level which covers up to 75% of the yield and 100% of the price. Producers, if they're buying that, would have to buy up themselves. NAP provides coverage against loss of yield to an eligible disaster condition for hemp grown for grain, fiber, or CBD. Or seed. NAP Basic is 50-55 coverage. It's available 55% of the average market price for crop losses that exceed 50% of expected production. Buy-up coverage is also available for NAP. Whole farm allows coverage of all revenue for commodities produced up to an 85% coverage rate, and that would be $8.5 million. This includes all hemp products. There's an 85% limit on your guarantee. So essentially, if you're under whole farm, you're insuring $8.5 million of $10 million worth of revenue. So we're going to dive into the MPCI policy here a little bit more, and show you what's covered, what's not, what's a cause of loss, and we'll compare that against NAP. So here's our coverage availability map. As I stated earlier, there were 20 or 21 states. In this case, it's 21 states that the MPCI pilot is available. when RMA was going through and working with the private submitter on developing this pilot program, there wasn't a lot of data out there. And we really needed data in order to make this product actuarially sound. It was made very conservatively. This is a new crop with not a lot of data, and we need, in order to add more coverage options onto a policy, it has to be backed up by data. So RMA and the submitters went through and we looked at the largest states that had this. We looked at growing, agricultural practices of growing hemp in Canada. I think there's even some research taken from Europe regarding this. But as you can see here, 21 states are included. The reason why it's only 21 states and not 50 is because we went ahead and took FSA data for reported acres, and every state that had more than 1,000 reported acres of hemp was included in the pilot. That's not to say next year in 2021 and beyond, more states won't be added, but we really need that 1,000-acre threshold. And that was decided on by the Federal Crop Insurance Board to only allow these certain states in. In order to comply with the regulations set forth in the policy, producers need to be licensed by their applicable state, tribe, or federal authorities, and have at least 1 year of production history. The crop must be planted in a field, be a variety adapted to the area, be grown under a processor contract. That is one of the big things that the administrator was talking about leading up to the adoption of this MPI policy, was that in order for us to, in order for the producer to get the MPCI coverage and have some risk management tool there, they need to have a contract. We were asked several times, like, what other crops have contracts associated with their policies, and there's about 25 different crops that have contracts associated with them. The one thing that comes to mind right now is like processing tomatoes. We need to have a minimum of 5 acres planted for CBD and 20 acres for grain and fiber. It must be planted on acreage meeting the rotational requirements and special provisions. That means, so in the South, you cannot follow, let me take this back. There are certain provisions set forth where you cannot follow hemp, or you cannot follow hemp with a certain crop. For example, there's white mold in soybeans. There was some data coming back that white mold could have implications on THC level, and those producers in the South are not able to grow soybeans and then follow those soybeans with hemp. It cannot be planted after the final plant date for the type of hemp, whether it's fiber seed or CBD in the county, and there's no late planting period like there is for other crops. And it can't be interplanted with other crops. So if you were growing CBD, if you're growing hemp for CBD and you wanted to put a cover crop in, you would not be able to do that. That's not permissible under the MPC. So here's what insurance covers. And as I stated earlier, it's very conservative because this is a new crop and we don't have a lot of data. Adverse weather conditions, natural perils that we see with other crops, such as drought, excess precipitation, earthquake, failure of irrigation, water supply, we've seen that. Wildfires, we've seen that. Insect and plant diseases, except for insufficient or improper application of crop protection measures, wildlife, or volcanic eruption. What it doesn't cover, anything above 0.3 in THC. So if you're growing hemp for CBD, you need to be testing. You need to be testing. You need to be testing, because once you're above 0.3, it's ineligible. So I know producers want to get as close to that 0.3 as possible, so they need the test. Failure to follow requirements contained in the processor's contract, any harvested production infected by mold, fungus, or any other organisms after harvest and any damage or lost production due to the inability of the market. That is more common than what you think in other crops such as corn, soybeans, wheat, actually all the crops that I can think of. Loss of market is not an insurable cause of loss. So here's MPCI and a NAP comparison. MPCI will not cover later preventive planting, replant costs. The next few things you have here on like trend yield adjustment, yield exclusion, yield cups. And yield cups is you can't have your APH, which is your actual production history, fall more than 10% per year. A yield floor or yield substitution. The last few terms I just rattled off, those are widely available on a lot of the row crops in the United States, and that's because we have a lot of data. So as we get more data, there's nothing preventing the Federal Crop Insurance Board for including these types of risk management tools along with the base MPCI as well. But right now we don't have the data to make it actuarially sound. As for NAP, there are no exclusions. Maximum historical adjusted gross income, or your AGI, of $900,000, and FSA has more information about that under. To be eligible for MPCI, like I said, stated earlier, you got to have 1 year of hemp production history, have a contract for the insured hemp, and have a minimum of your 5 acres for CBD or 20 for everything else. Indemnities are based on elected coverage levels. To be eligible for NAP, producer must have a contract for the purchase of the hemp. Obviously, subject to the maximum payment limitation, which is going to be $100,000 or $125,000 for the 50-55 and $300,000 for the buyout. Here's where you can go ahead and get more information. You can look at our website at rma.usda.gov. We have a special hemp link there. You can contact an insurance agent as well. If you go onto USDA's website, or excuse me, RMA's website, we have an agent locator. You just type in your zip code and it'll auto-populate a list of agents in your area, and you can reach out to them to see if they're offering coverage for hemp. For NAP, just go to any county FSA office, and there's 2,000 some of them around the United States. So that's all I have for you today. I hope this was a informational kind of overview of the risk management tools that USDA has to offer for hemp. Going forward, 2020 and beyond, we could see some changes, but those changes need to be backed up by sound data and be actuarially sound. Thank you very much, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Thanks so much, RJ. And I did see that you saw one question that came through on the chat stream, and Doris also weighed in a little bit on that. But either do you want to make any comments now about any of the issues that have been raised, or does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question before we transition to our next speaker?
So I just got the question back on the question that Doris raised, and the answer I got back was the MPCI product and whole farm both allow for a measurement of uncertainty. The special provisions for the MPCI product include the following paragraph. I'll just copy and paste the paragraph into the chat box here, and Doris, you can take a look at that. Also, I have some other data that I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here.
Oh yeah, that's probably the best way to answer that question. That's a lot of info.
Yep.
Thank you for that.
So you all see my screen. Here's the program expansion for hemp. Total NAP policies for 447. Total MPCIs were just below 700. And then I have the breakdown here by state. Alabama, California, Colorado, all these states are the ones that were on the MPCI versus pilot states. So, and you'll see on there's one state, Maine. It is one of the states that was approved for the pilot, but it does not have any MPCIs. RMA considers that whole Northeast or New England area an underserved area. Traditionally, there's a lot of smaller farms up there that don't really take advantage of the risk management tools that are available. And that's one big push that the administrator has been doing, is reaching out to these underserved areas to let them know about the risk management options they have. So hopefully, moving forward, some agents up there will take a keen interest in this, and maybe we'll see some more participation in RMA programs up there. That's all I have. If you have any other questions, please feel free to ask or contact me directly. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And again, all of our speakers are kind of staying online here. So particularly with things like that, where either a link or a written out explanation is better, please do keep asking questions in the chat box. That might be the best way to capture it anyway. So with that, we're going to move on to our next speaker, again, trying to make up a little bit of time. And Kelly Shea is with Charlotte's Web and is going to give us a little bit of an industry supply chain perspective. So when you're ready, go ahead and please do start her video. Thank you. Stars about helping us get back on schedule and still giving lots of opportunities for interaction by answering questions as we go in the sidebar. Even though Kelly, you've already addressed some of those questions in the chat box. If people want to throw out one more question live, we can do it. We have someone comparing hemp to bell peppers in the right-hand side, which I just love that analogy. For someone who came from Iowa, can only handle bell peppers when I grew up there. Now I'm halfway up the Scoville scale from being able to live in the West and get more exposure. It's a great analogy. But how about one live question, and then we'll turn to our last speaker and be back on schedule to make sure we're leaving time for discussion today. You're muted.
I was just saying, if they don't have questions, that's great. It means we just hit on everything they wanted to know. So
great. Well, and again, Kelly's going to stick around and can answer some of those in the chat box as well. So if she's comfortable.
Don, sorry, this is Abdel. I do have a question for Kelly. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I just wondering, I hear this from farmers a lot, that they say, well, the more big companies get into the business, the less opportunity a small farmer will have into making a profit or from growing hemp. What do you think?
Well, I would say, much like the rest of agriculture, farms of different sizes fit different parts of agriculture. So if somebody is growing a large amount of the same thing for more of an industrial use, so think about corn as an analogy, maybe it will be larger acres. If somebody's growing a more particular genetic for a particular company for a particular use, it might be smaller acres. So I think we are going to need farmers of all sizes, growing hemp, farms of all sizes, and I think we're going to have larger and smaller acreages depending on the end use.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
Yes.
think that's a good answer, and I think that's actually a nice segue into Jane speaking, because one common denominator you'll see with some of us in academia who switched to working on hemp is that we came from working with other niche and differentiated products, because there is at least some evidence that this is both going to be not completely commoditized anytime soon, and with some of the issues that have already been raised about how consumers are going to have to be communicated with about it, it is going to open up a few different pathways people could have business strategies in this space. And so to kind of illuminate that further, we have Dr. Jane Kolenditsky from the University of Vermont. Tyler's already mentioned her as someone who's leading a project looking at the economics and dynamics of economics in this sector. So we, of course, wanted to wrap up with her today so she could give us a little bit about her beliefs on consumer perceptions about this sector. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jane and we'll run her presentation.
Well, thank you, Dawn, and thank you everyone for having me. My presentation is about 20 minutes long, maybe 19, but I was asked to give a little bit of my background, and I first gave a presentation on consumer demand for hemp in 1998 in Poland. And at that time, Vermont was interested in the hemp market. And when I presented to the legislature, I was told under no uncertain terms that until they could develop a hemp plant with orange leaves instead of green leaves, there would be no hemp in the marketplace because it couldn't be distinguished from marijuana. And so we've come a long way since then. And my presentation was not, it's based on 2019 and 2020 data, very, very preliminary, because at that point I could not obtain funding to do this study. So I used my F&A return money to ask some questions on a statewide, we call it the Vermonter poll, which is a representative sample of Vermonters. And then I compare it to some of the national statistics. But I think it does lay the foundation to show where there is opportunity in the market. And I will say that last week's presentation, I was very pleased to see that markets for hemp and consumer demand was one of the most widely needed aspects of information. So Tyler, I hope my presentation runs. Greetings from Burlington, Vermont. Here we are broadcasting live. I hope this goes well. I'm so happy to be here, but I'm kind of sad that I'm not in Colorado at this time. This presentation is Consumer Awareness and Use of Hemp-Based Products, a 2020 update. Of course, that's me, Dr. Jane Kolodinsky from the University of Vermont, and my co-author is Hannah Lacasse, who is my MS student in Community Development and Applied Economics. Of course, this is a picture of Heather Darby, the famous Heather Darby, hemp expert, agronomy expert in the state of Vermont. So we know hemp is a sustainable alternative. Hemp, it's a sustainable crop, it's biodiversity friendly, etc. It makes sustainable products. It has durable fibers that are resistant to water and saline damage, etc. And there's potential of the hemp industry to diversify farmers' plantings and to perhaps earn them some extra income. But we're really here today to discuss the end product and consumer demand for hemp-based products, of which there are so many different products, from hemp fabrics, which can be anything from mats that are hidden in airplane fuselage, to garden mats, to high-end clothing, to face masks that we see in increasing number right now because of the microbial properties of hemp, the hemp plastics, hemp concrete, hemp milk, hemp shoes, hemp rope, hemp soap, hemp paper, hemp nutritional supplements, and even hemp cell phone covers. So let's start with comparing hemp production in Vermont versus the United States. And of course, we know there's been a rising interest in production since the passing of the 2018 Farm Bill, but the trials go back farther than that. So let's look at Vermont, and we can see the increase from 2016 to 2019. We see the same across the United States, and the figures in Vermont for 2020, or this year, says that the number of registered hemp production acres has fallen. We also know that 75% in Vermont, 75% of registered hemp growers were growing hemp for hemp floral biomass, which means CBD, but there are so many other things that can be made from the hemp plant. And unfortunately, 50% of growers that were surveyed did not have a buyer at the end of the 2019 growing season. So in Vermont, we saw almost a 5,000% increase in the number of acres registered for hemp production between 2016 and 2019. And we saw a little bit more, a little over 5,000% increase across the United States. When we look at the number of hemp registrations per year, we can see the same trend, where in Vermont, the growth from 2016 to 2019 was huge. Same thing in the United States, but this time the growth rate in Vermont was higher, over 3,000% in hemp registrations, whereas in the rest of the U.S. it increased by about 2,000%, saying that there were a lot of smaller growers in Vermont, given the size of our state, compared to the United States. So why Vermont? We're a little state. I've been told we're toy agriculture in a toy state, but don't count Vermont out. Vermont often is a bellwether for the rest of the country. And just to test that, we looked at 2017 estimates of hemp-based product sales and compared that to the 2020 results that we got, asking consumers what kind of hemp products that they purchased. And we can see that looking at these pie charts, Vermont looks pretty comparable to the rest of the country. So that gives me an indication that by doing some of this consumer demand research in Vermont, we could be a bellwether for the rest of the country. So we look at hemp CBD, the percentage of the pie, consumer textiles, personal care products, food products, Vermont lagging behind the rest of the country there. Industrial applications, and in Vermont that would be construction, plastics, and rope. We don't have supplements in Vermont. We didn't have that as a separate category. So we move on to other, pretty comparable. And I think that other category, there are some interesting things happening, anywhere from pet bedding, from very small to very large animals, bird food, and even cattle supplements, nutritional supplements. So here's our study. Research on the economic implications of hemp across the value chain are critical to inform this growing market. We can grow it, but unless we know that there's demand for the products that can be made from hemp, there's no sense in growing it. There's a gap in evidence-based research for consumer demand for these hemp-based products, and that's what this study is all about. It's a start to look at consumer demand for products that are made with hemp. And here, just for your viewing pleasure on the right, gives you an idea of where hemp is being grown in the state. It's being grown everywhere, but you look at Caledonia, Addison, and Rutland counties as the largest producers of hemp in Vermont. So what did we do? We have a statistically representative telephone survey of Vermont residents collected in February of 2019 and February of 2020. This is based on a random sample drawn from a list of landline and cell phone numbers. And we ran some both bivariate analysis and some multivariate analysis using logistic regressions, and our sample size ranged from 929 to 946. And our results have a margin of error of around 3%. So this study focuses on 11 survey questions related to familiarity with hemp-based products, support for hemp production, and use of hemp-based products. We coded respondents as being generally familiar with or as general users of hemp if they selected any of the given product categories. So we're focusing on hemp CBD oil, hemp clothing, and hemp paper. Although as we move onward with this research in the next few years, we can expand those categories. I do want you to know that there was no monetary support for this study. It was all based on my indirect returns from my sponsored research program. So there wasn't a lot of dollars to do this, but I just really thought it was important to start looking at the demand side for hemp-based products. We also looked for support for industrial hemp as an agricultural product in our state, and then uses of hemp-based products, including CBD oil, clothing, personal care products, food products, and rope. Here's what our sample looks like. You can see that on the right in 2019 and 2020. We basically had demographic characteristics, education, gender, income, and political affiliation, as well as Chittenden County resident, which is our urban county compared to the rest of the state. And we also had age. Now, how did we do this? Well, we really wanted to see whether or not there were differences in the way that the demographic characteristics impacted our dependent variables in 2019 and 2020. That means 2019 and 2020 were not just intercept shifters, that it was both year and the demographic characteristics that made a difference in predicting whether you're supportive of hemp, whether or not you've heard of hemp products, or whether or not you're a hemp product user. And I want to say in every single case, we could not reject the null hypothesis that all of those interaction terms were different from zero. So really what we ended up doing was using the year as an intercept shifter, and there's no interaction effects or changes in the slope shifters of the demographic variables. So we start with some bivariate analysis, and then we move on to our multivariate analysis for each of the dependent variable categories. So you can see on the right-hand side here that about 3/4 of Vermonters are supportive of hemp production in Vermont, and that is not statistically different. It's the same. 3/4 of Vermonters were supportive of hemp production in Vermont in 2019 and in 2020. So we looked at whether or not we could predict support, and what we find was, I'm only showing you significant results here, is that, and these are the exponent betas, so I can say that the older you are slightly less likely to be supportive of hemp, but it's almost one. So age doesn't really matter. Your higher income categories, but not the highest income categories, you're about 2 to 2.5 times more likely to support hemp production. And what's really interesting, and what we'll find almost across the board in these results, is that it's your political affiliation, not necessarily your demographic characteristics, that predicts your support for hemp, your knowledge, your familiarity, and your use of hemp-based products. So like so many other things in our country today, things seem to be a political situation and not based on the characteristics, your other characteristics, which is interesting. So when we get to the end, one of the conclusions is going to be that there's a lot of room in the hemp market because it's not your demographic characteristics. It's just basically your political affiliation. And so there's so much room to grow in as we learn more about hemp, that hemp is not marijuana, that hemp is not THC, et cetera. So moving on with familiarity with hemp-based products, we can see that we've grown by about 10 percentage points, from 87 to 98% of Vermonters are familiar with any one of the hemp-based products that we've listed. And the specific hemp-based products are CBD oil, clothing, and paper products. And all of these are significantly greater in 2020 than they were in 2019. So we ran logistic regressions for familiarity with hemp-based products in general, which is the first column on your right with the numerical results: CBD oil, hemp clothing, and hemp paper. As I stated before, we could not reject the null hypothesis that the interaction terms of year and the demographics were significantly different from zero. So we use year as just an intercept shifter, which means that all of the variables that you find significant, the demographic characteristics significant, they're just, they did not change for the 2 years. And we see that the demographics are really all over the place. With hemp CBD oil, older people were a little less likely to have heard of it, and those between 25 and 50 and over $100,000 a year were about 2.5 times more likely to be familiar with it. So we have year in every case. People are more familiar. Between 2.4 times more likely to have heard of hemp paper to 3.9 times more likely to have heard of hemp CBD oil. There we have age. When you're in the 9.95s, that's basically, it might be very significant, but it's not a lot less significant than 1, just as likely to be familiar with those products. Moving on to the general use of hemp-based products, we see a huge increase. Almost 2 times as many people said that they used a hemp-based product in 2020 compared to 2019, but not quite. And indeed, that is highly significant. Looking at general use, that's used any hemp-based product. Once again, we could not reject the null hypothesis that all of the interaction effects were different from 0, so we're just using year as an intercept shifter. And for general use, we see that about 2.3 people are 2.3 times more likely to have used a hemp-based product in 2020 compared to 2019. Seems to be seeping out there into the marketplace, and people are purchasing it. And we once again see our political affiliation with our independents and our progressives much more likely to have used a hemp-based product compared to other, or compared to the Republican group, which is our reference group. We can look at the use of specific hemp-based products, hemp-based CBD oil, clothing, personal care products, food products, and hemp rope, all significantly much higher, all significantly higher in 2020 compared to 2019. Quite actually, it's striking, the increase. We did not pool the results for 2019 and 2020 for hemp-based products because the way that use question was asked was different across the 2 years, and we did not want to bias our results. But we really don't see that demographics are predicting the use of hemp-based products, except for that political affiliation, and even more so in the year 2020. So what does this mean? It means that as hemp-based products are infiltrating the market or are having an increased presence as product ingredients, we're seeing that more people are familiar and more people are actually purchasing products with the ingredients. But it's not the demographics that seems to be driving this change. So when we look at year, what does year really stand for? It stands for all of the variables that we were not able to include, and that could be attitudes towards the product, that could be the media attention towards the product, advertising of these products. But it does tell me that there is an increase in demand for hemp-based products over time. It's not due necessarily with demographic characteristics. So there's a lot of room out there. If we look at political affiliation as being what's driving the bus here, there's a lot of hope and ways that hemp can grow in the marketplace. So we did see Vermonters are more familiar with and using more hemp goods, despite producer focus on CBD. So there might be some room in the marketplace to grow hemp for fiber and food. And we did see some demographic influence on hemp demand, but it wasn't consistent across all categories. And in many cases was not significant at all. So when we're moving on this year, we're going to redo this survey. We're going to be able to ask a few more questions about attitudes and intentions and characteristics of products, because I did obtain some funding through USDA to look at consumer demand for hemp. Kentucky, Colorado, and UVM have been awarded a USDA foundational grant to look at the economic impact of hemp. And so we'll be looking at a few sectors that hemp can infiltrate, but those sectors haven't been built yet. We're hoping to be able to develop metrics for hemp and how we can look at the hemp as part of the food system and look at success in local food systems with the production of hemp. And that one was just funded too. So there's so much more work to do. This was just the tip of the iceberg, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
Thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. Greetings from.
So I think we did it, guys. We got back on track. You heard all the presenters we hoped you did. Sorry for those couple of hiccups where there was some audio issues, but I hope everyone feels like we got back on track. And now even though we don't have quite the amount of time we were going to for Q&A, we certainly do have some time left, and all of our panelists are still here. So again, now that we don't have to play presentations, if you want to turn your audio on and see faces and speak up and ask your questions in real time with your voice instead of in the chat box, you're more than welcome to. I think we've gradually been handling most of the questions that have been put in the chat box already, but if someone saw one that didn't get addressed, please bring that up. And otherwise, even you panelists certainly can ask questions of each other as well, but not the time to be shy. Anybody who has questions, this is a great time to raise them. So I guess I'll ask a question then. Putting together a couple of the puzzle pieces we've heard all the way from, there is still so relatively little awareness and understanding of exactly what this sector is, some commingling with it, too much commingling with, the marijuana market, which is not federally still universally allowed. And then at the same time, even the things that we all who have some context want to believe about, being in the weeds about how we do manage the supply chain and get some of the details right, would almost, because of that lack of awareness, be too much for an average consumer to actually take in and understand what that means to them. How do we navigate figuring out the way to still be very attentive to the details the way we need to with our regulatory environment, but also start doing that outreach, awareness, and consumer brand building that's going to be necessary for this market to take shape?
So I can take a stab at the consumer part of it. And I think that there are going to be market segments. When we looked a little bit farther at who was buying, and not in a multivariate sense, but in just a bivariate sense, who was buying what? CBD was all over the map. Everybody was buying CBD. But believe it or not, the older consumers, and I'm saying 60 plus, were the ones that really understood hemp clothing. And I don't know if that goes back to, the yippie 60s or whatever, when hemp was an alternative product. So I think there's a lot of room in the marketplace, and a first step, just based on our preliminary results, is that this isn't a targeting issue. This is like a public health issue where you can target everyone. We usually say there isn't a market for everyone. Every product has a target market. But if the issue is separating hemp from drugs, that I think will help hemp across the board, right? To get that message out, like the public health message, that the public service message that hemp and THC are not the same thing, and that it's okay.
And so a question aligned to that from someone is, how do you separate increased demand from initial curiosity when trying to assess new demand for hemp products? And Callie, perhaps you even can weigh in here, as
Sure.
someone who worked in some sectors where I'm thinking of, for instance, some of the plant-based milk and dairy products, the same kind of thing is, how do you start assessing what of those people who have initial curiosity are really going to take and hold and become part of your segment versus the ones who it's very exploratory? And where do you start seeing that research come together, Jane and Kelly, where you can pick up what's going to be long-term customers versus curious customers?
Right. So we sort of break that out two ways because we sell in retail brick and mortar stores, but we also have an e-commerce platform. With our e-commerce platform, we get firsthand data, right? We can look at how often people come back and buy again or buy once and don't come back again. And we can look at what sorts of products they're buying. In brick and mortar, we work with Nielsen and also with IRI and SPIN and are working to build those research categories of information, much like you would for any of the other more developed categories at retail. But like I said, we're not even going to have the data we need until the products are carried on shelf. So right now, topicals with hemp extracts are really on the rise because topicals are not in that same FDA quagmire. And so retailers are more comfortable carrying cosmetics, carrying over the counter, carrying topicals than they are carrying ingestibles like a dietary supplement or something of that sort.
So I'm so glad that you asked that question, Dawn. There's a couple of answers to that. First is the proof is in the pudding. If the products are of high quality and add value to that consumer, and they work as they say they will. Clothing items are durable and fashionable. Health and beauty products deliver the characteristics that they say. That's one way to get repeat customers, right? So it was a curiosity, but hey, I liked what I saw. I liked what I got. Because for these products, they are experience products, and sometimes they're even what we would call credence goods in terms of you don't know what the benefit is even after you use the product. But there's another thing, and this goes way back to the beginning of my career. For people looking into what product should I produce, what value added, you have people who could care less about what the product is as long as it works. Those might be privately consumed necessities. So we know that hemp makes great insulation. I do not, and nobody knows what brand I bought. I know it works, right? Hemp bedding for cattle and horses. It has microbial properties. I know that this bedding is soft. My horses and cattle love it. I don't care what brand it is. I don't care, I don't care what it's made out of. It works. Versus, very high-end Italian fabrics that were made out of hemp. That's a luxury product, and you might actually, put hemp on your little logo on your, above your pocket. And so, but each of those products, whoever is manufacturing and selling those, has to find the right production cost to meet what the retail, price that they can charge. So for something like a garden mat, instead of using black plastic to grow your hemp, maybe there is hemp waste that can be turned into hemp garden mats. As long as it costs less and it is more ecologically friendly, then we might see a whole other market. So, there are privately consumed luxuries like your mattress, privately consumed necessities, publicly consumed luxuries like a Rolex, and publicly consumed necessities. And I think if we can picture hemp in a variety of products for people who don't care what the product is as long as it works, versus people who or consumers who really care and purchase that for a reason that it is hemp, we might see a variety of different growth areas in the marketplace.
Yeah, I think I would add one more thing to Jay Grant of UK's question. Is I had said earlier in the pre-recorded talk that a big concern of mine is if people buy products that are not efficacious and they don't work. So without regulations and without standards, you can have products on the marketplace that don't perform. So you will have somebody come into the category, try the product, have no relief for whatever wellness reason they were taking it, and completely leave the category and not even think about the fact that it was the brand or the product and not the plant itself.
You know, that reminds me of a statistic that was shared 2 years ago at the Vermont Hemp Conference. There was a study done that showed that 70% of the samples did not contain what they said they did. And the variability within that, you know, if it said this is some certain grams or whatever, and that's not my area, that varied by as much as, you know, 60% either way. So, so you're absolutely right, Kelly. And consumers, unless there is some assurance, especially for the supplement side of the fence, not versus the, you know, versus the clothing side.
Yeah, Jane's spot on. And as a matter of fact, FDA did release their long-awaited House of Propes request for information on market surveillance. So that will show some disparities in the testing they did when you all take a look at it.
So in to make sure I'm staying on time, I think Abdel had one question. I'll let him go ahead and ask. But then Jane, there's another question from Jay Grant in the chat box that might be better to respond to typing anyway. So Abdel, go ahead and ask your question. And then Jane, if you don't mind responding to Jay Grant about your survey details, that'd be great.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it seems to me that this question is for all the panelists and regulators, if there are any in the audience. It seems to me that the US has an advantage when it comes to CBD and CBD products in terms of volume, in terms of products out there, in terms of breeding, et cetera, et cetera. And you know, that THC, you know, how do we keep that advantage compared to relative to other countries like Canada, Europe, China? You know, I think that 0.3% THC level may have been started by the Canadians. And maybe somebody can shed some light on that. Thank you.
So I did put something in the chat box, but for studies like ours, where we're just doing telephone surveys and it's not on a sensitive topic, ours are exempt from IRB. We can, they go through really expedited review. And because it's a survey, someone can just choose not to answer, and that's the consent. I consent not to do the survey. And so IRB is not a problem. A couple days.
Well, I think though this is actually overlap with both what Abdel said and what you just answered. I guess I'm curious, do you really feel like this is uniform across the country though? Like Vermont's IRB handled it easily because it was Vermont and they understood hemp. Yeah, Jay Grant just said, wow. I think there is, again, some really lack of awareness that not every even university or every set of regulatory bodies, and that might vary by geography or by, you know, who knows. I think this unawareness actually has filtered down into actually also being how we are being overseen with projects and so forth. But maybe I'm overstating that, but given Jay Grant just put in all capitals, wow, I guess not. So, you know, perhaps it is that's part of what this community practice should be doing, is establishing what is happening, what's best practices and so forth. So anybody who is in a geography or a situation where it doesn't feel quite as even handed, and that because of a lack of understanding about hemp, things are being handled more in a more challenging way than necessary, there's some kind of precedent to show them. I'm not exactly sure what that would look like, but maybe that's something we need to think about.
So I really hadn't even thought about that, but now that you say that, Dawn, we tried to work with the University of Maine because they have a huge paper processing facility that was funded by USDA. And we were told by Maine, we can't touch this, you know, go away. And I think they missed a huge opportunity, but you know, to prototype different types of papers and combos of hemp and perhaps tree pulp. But yeah, yeah. So that's why Tyler doesn't have his IRB approval yet.
Yeah, we'll pick on Kentucky. That's the way. There's a few other discussion questions about that 0.3, which at least from conversations I've been in, we could spend a whole day on just that. But Brian did answer it to some degree. But again, I think just repeating, I think we heard in different ways from every speaker today that is this kind of crux point where both a lot of policy, market development, and risk management are being created around, but yet I hear a lot of belief that that may be a viable number that with enough information and research could be flexible. So I guess let's end the day, and any panelist who wants to weigh in on this can. How pivotal is that number, and whether it's going to be stable or changed or revisited or rethought going to be to how this market develops and how we manage risk in this market? And anyone who wants to speak up on that can.
Sure, I'll take a swing at it, I guess. So I think it's an important number to know, and to be on, I guess, to have the genetics in place to be able to meet whatever that number is going to be. So I think that's where our competitive advantage is going to be, is can we breed and create the proper genetics if it's 0.3 and the rest of the world adheres to that. I think we have one of the premier breeding programs across the country to be able to access that. If it goes to 1%, I think we can do the same. But keep in mind, when you go to 1%, now you're talking 25% CBD. So the number of acres is probably going to shrink unless the demand for these products really, really ramps up, because you're not going to need as many acres to make the same amount of crude or CBD. So there are pros and cons to doing that. But I think in general, the U.S. is, for the most part, out in front on the CBD market. And we'll see if we can maintain that. But we're going to have to get some regulations and standards in here to be able to do that one way or another, whether it stays at 0.3 or whether it moves to 1.
So I'll go ahead and give my little input here. 0.3 is, that was in the Farm Bill. We have a Farm Bill every 4 to 5 years, and that could change. So, it could be 0.5, it could be, as Tyler said, it could be 0.1. Just kind of all depends, what Congress thinks, and whatever Congress decides to do in the Farm Bill, USDA will have to implement.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that last topic? We are over time, and like I said, people can feel free to hop off, but in case people want to linger on because they have questions, I wanted to make sure we kept it open. Again, someone wanted to, posits that flower production seems to be the future model, and that the CBD, the lower CBD concentrations are going to be completely dependent on if maybe we even make some R&D investments as a country in getting processing costs down so that they can be viable products. And if anyone wants to weigh in on that. And again, some agreement that we do seem to be having the leading edge in this country on breeding, and specifically breeding that's going to help us to manage some of that risk if the THC numbers stay at the low level that they currently are. Again, and if anyone wants to weigh in on any of these. Again, I think we just got a lot of really good feedback that this was a really nice blend of speakers and a good portfolio of topics to cover in this space. No doubt we will be revisiting at least a couple of these issues, both in future week conversations and those focus groups and breakouts that the team is going to have to think about what our research agenda is going forward. But I guess as we start to see comments and questions wrap up a little bit, please leave a couple more comments in the box thanking our speakers. They particularly did really well today, given we had a little bit of technical difficulty, and they handled it like pros. We stayed on time, and again, I hope this virtual conference and this breaking up across 5 weeks is working out well for all of you attending. We sure have appreciated how engaged the audiences have been. And if anyone else has any other comments to wrap up with, but otherwise we may call it a day. Again, we'll keep this room open for about 5 minutes in case people want to put any more in the chat box, give their information, give links to things they're working on, but feel free to flow away and we'll see you next week.
Don, I was just
Sure.
typing something here. Monique is going to email a survey to get feedback. I think she's going to do it here soon. So please respond to it when you get it. We would love to have your feedback.
And there will be more information coming as well about how you get access to some of these recordings, either because you found something interesting and wanted to see one graph again, or because you have to miss one of these 5 weeks, where we'll be sharing more information about how those will be available as well. Okay, well, goodbye all, and we'll see you next week.